Hello chess fans. Today I'm excited to show you a game between two of the great chess rivals of this century. Vladimir Kramnik is playing white against Viswanathan Anand. We're going to see Kramnik's aggressive and sacrificial side, but at the critical moment, Anand unveils one of his most famous and brilliant moves to successfully fend off Kramnik's attack and carry the day. Kramnik opens the game with the move knight to f3, a move that he almost trademarked in top-level chess, and after the natural following moves, he plays bishop to g5, entering one of the most theoretical positions in chess. Now, at this point, Anand could have captured on c4, entering the famous Botvinnik variation, one of the most sharp and theoretically challenging positions in all of chess. Instead, he plays the move h6, entering the Moscow variation and offering Kramnik a choice. He can capture on f6, which is the quieter continuation, but it is one where white has struggled to prove an advantage and to challenge black after he gives up the bishop pair. Or he can play bishop h4 as Kramnik does. Now this is the anti-Moscow Gambit, and after pawn captures on c4, Kramnik is going to let the pawn on c4 go in return for extra central control and in return for some gained time, because Anand is going to have captured the pawn on c4, a loss of a tempo, and he's going to need to defend the pawn, which is also sort of a loss of a tempo. So e4, g5, bishop g3, pawn to b5, bishop e2, bishop b7 are all played, and now there's a choice. There are actually 5 theoretical moves in this position. You can play h4, you can play castles, you can play knight e5, you can play queen c2, but Kramnik goes for the least popular of the 5 available choices. He plays 10e5 in this position. I am by no means an expert on these variations at all. I'm really struggling just to provide a larger overview of these variations. But I'm a little skeptical of this move on a very broad positional sense, because it locks in the bishop on g3, right? You feel like you're turning this into a giant pawn. Now, the move knight to d5 is actually the most popular continuation here, and black has done very well. Anand rejects this, but it seems like maybe this is the move people should look to today as being the most reliable for black. That said, Nakamura beat Gelfand in this variation just a year ago, so there's very much an ongoing debate in this line. Instead, Anand plays knight to h5, and the knight on h5 is going to capture the bishop on g3, picking up that bishop pair, but it's also tactically vulnerable. It's lined up with this bishop on e2, and after the inclusion of a4 and a6, this allows Kramnik to play in a sacrificial and speculative way. He plays knight takes g5 in this position. Because the knight on h5 is loose, the only way for Anand to really continue is to capture on g3, and then the only way for Kramnik to continue is to capture on f7. Now, king captures f7 and pawn captures g3 kind of leads to a settling of the position. Kramnik has sacrificed a piece. He's now down a piece for only one pawn, really. But he's going to rapidly include his bishop, his knight, his rook, with the castling move as well, and his queen should easily access the action too. In the meantime, black has a lot of pieces that are going to struggle to be effective or really involved in the action at all. So while this sacrifice is very, very murky, right, it seems to offer decent chances at least to Kramnik. It is a sacrifice that can both lead to a brilliant attacking win from Kramnik or a brilliant defensive win from Anand. So it's exactly the kind of variation that two combative and fantastic players might naturally want to enter into. So Anand plays the move king to g8. There are many options here and many other moves, and we're going to gloss over a lot of them. Castles, knight d7, bishop g4, attacking e6, queen to e7, and now knight e4. I think this is an interesting juncture. At this point, I think the most natural move in the world is pawn to c5. It is the move that I would be thinking about. I'm sure it's the move that Anand was thinking about. It is just so obvious to open up this bishop and to attack the loose knight on e4. Presumably, Anand judged that this move could not be played for some reason. It is very scary after knight d6 because the bishop on b7 is hit, and after the bishop moves, d5 seeming to be the most natural square, rook f7, there is a lot of attacking pressure around the black king. But it seems that after queen d8, necessary to defend d7, then queen b1 is not decisive, or queen c2, because of queen g5. It's really hard to say what Kramnik and Anand did and did not calculate in this variation. There's so much going on, but for some reason, both players seem to reject the possibility of c5, thinking that it was decisive for white. But when you look at it with Stockfish nowadays, right, and of course it's easy to look at it with Stockfish when we're not the players dealing with the position, right, it does seem like c5 was playable here. If that's the case, I have no doubt that Anand would have played it had his analysis been able to back that evaluation up. So after knight e4, instead he plays the move rook h7, which is a natural defensive move, but not as natural as c5. Knight d6 attacks the loose bishop on b7. Rook b8 defends that bishop, although it is a bit of a passive move. And here's where Kramnik could have punished the omission of c5 with a nice continuation. I'd encourage you to pause the video here and try to figure out what Kramnik could have played and didn't. So, if you've paused the video and found this continuation, you managed to, in this one tiny moment, outdo the great Vladimir Kramnik. Pawn takes b5 is the key move, opening up the a file for the rook. After a takes b5, the rook can infiltrate very effectively, but after c takes b5, knight takes b7, seemingly not something you want to do because the knight's such a powerful piece on d6. You don't want to trade it when you're attacking and you've already sacrificed a piece. Rook takes a6, e6 is falling. e6 is really the critical weak point in black's position in this entire line, and when it goes here, Kramnik's position is virtually winning. I would speculate that this continuation was missed simply because Kramnik didn't want to capture on b7 with the knight on d6, but if he can get to e6, it is worth it. Instead, he played the move pawn to b4, and now there's some very interesting play from both players. The position is very sharp. I'm not going to dive into everything. Suffice to say there's some brilliant moves here and some inaccuracies in the following continuation. At this point here, queen takes h5 picks up the loose h5 pawn, and now the move knight e4 happens. So we skipped ahead a little bit, and we're at a critical position. White is all over the weak points in black's position, and it's really, really hard to find a move for black. In fact, almost every move that black has loses on the spot. I want you to pause your video if you can and see if you can find a way for black, despite the loss of material, to defend all of his weak points and coordinate his position. It is a very difficult continuation, and if you really want to try and solve it, I would suggest likely spending as much as 30 minutes on this position. The move that Anand played, one of his great moves, one of the great defensive moves of all time, is pawn to c5. We talked about this move earlier and said that it was the most natural move in the world, and it still is. But this time, to go for it, you need some extra courage because you have to sacrifice a piece. Since Kramnik has already sacrificed a piece, you're able to hold material equality after giving up a piece, but still, it takes some courage when you're facing an attack to give back the piece and say that, you can't break me, right? I'm holding everything, you can't break me. Pawn c5, knight takes g5. This wins that bishop on g5 because both rook takes and queen takes lose to bishop takes e6 check. The e6 point must be defended, which is why bishop d5 is now played. Anand's willing to stay down the piece, right? He let Kramnik take the bishop on g5. They're now equal in material, and he very patiently plays his bishop to d5. Suddenly, the bishop is incorporated in the defense of the position, and e6 is held. At this point, there's no longer a way for Kramnik to break through. And because e6 is defended, there are actual threats to the knight on g5. So now the knight on g5 retreats, and after pawn takes b4, Anand has a massive queenside pawn mass that's likely to queen, which is basically what happens in the game. I mean, it doesn't actually queen, but the threat of it queening wins the game. We should back up one move because there's basically one more critical position here. Instead of retreating this knight, Kramnik could have played knight takes e6, immediately sacrificing the piece back, which is kind of stunning and hard to consider. It's very difficult in chess when something is happening and then the trend is broken. Like Anand sacrifices the piece to break Kramnik's attack, and then you have to consider an entirely new sequence of continuations to break the new trend in the position. So it's hard for Kramnik, I think, to consider knight takes e6 here, once again entering a sacrificial speculative mode. But after bishop takes e6, pawn takes b5, rook takes, pawn takes b5, pawn takes c5, Stockfish is saying that the position is equal. I would instead say chaotic. I would not say equal, but this does seem to hold water for white. It's very interesting that you would immediately give the piece back and create your own set of dangerous pawns, but this gives white counterplay. There's play for both sides here. It seems like anything is possible, whereas in the game continuation, the play is all Anand's way. So, going back, the knight retreats. Anand picks up some massive queenside pawns. Pawn takes b5, pawn takes b5. Look at this. It seems like Anand's king might be exposed, but it's no longer true. There's no way to get at the king or any weak points in the black position, really. Actually, I take that back a little bit because rook a6 was the last recommendation we have here. And if the pawns start marching, queen h6 does create some counterplay against the e6 pawn. Now, this still looks good for Anand, but there's some counterplay, which is something. So instead, knight h4 was played, and now there's no more counterplay. At this point, Anand is just winning. I have no further comments on the game other than to say that his winning technique is, as always, beautiful. And he does follow up with some nice continuations here. Primarily, rook takes f3. When rook takes on f3 leads to back rank and queening problems. And pawn takes f3, as in the game, leads to bishop h3, attacking the rook, attacking this weak point. Of course, these pawns are still dangerous and likely to promote as well. And the final moves to the game were these moves when there's no perpetual or anything for white. Black is up oodles of material, and we're ready to continue forward with these pawns as well. There are many ways for Anand to win. So I hope you enjoyed this game. I think it's a brilliant defensive effort. Again, one of the most brilliant defenses of all time. If you enjoyed the game, please consider subscribing to the channel on YouTube or share this video with a friend. Thank you so much and have a great day.